My name is Jim Wells. I actually worked at Morehead State University for 23 years, but by virtue of being in school at Breckenridge, pretty much all 12 years of school, and at MSU, I've been on campus for 40 years before I retired.
Jim, your family has long history here at the university, going all the way back to the normal school days of your great-grandfather.
That's true. People don't talk about that much. My grandfather, W.O. Lappin, was one of the presidents of the normal school. He actually got that by virtue of being a stump riding, I guess, preacher in the Christian church, down at the Morehead Christian Church. And then, of course, my grandfather, Warren Lappin, grew up here, and they lived all over the country. They lived in Illinois, North Carolina, and the stories he told me about those places. And he ended up going to school at Transylvania, and they brought him here. His first job at Morehead State in 1922 or so, maybe 1921, after World War I, was his first baseball coach. And then 50 years later, he retired as what they call the provost now. He was the dean of academic affairs.
Warren Lappin was a legendary figure on campus. All these things I read about him, and for the most part, everyone we've interviewed who had worked in the era that he was still here had interesting stories about him. So who was Dr. Lappin, and what can you say about your grandfather that ties to the school's history?
Dr. Lappin was kind of an enigma to a lot of people because I saw him as my grandfather. He's a guy that when I was a little boy, he came, you have to understand, this guy, he had a choice when he was young of becoming a baseball player or a concert violinist. He had to choose one because he ended up breaking a finger and couldn't finger a violin properly, so he chose baseball and ended up being the first baseball coach at Morehead State. So he was a great musician. He was the son of a preacher, so he had a strong religious background. He was a brilliant educator in his own right. He always laughed. He said he got a master's degree back in the 20s, early 20s from the University of Chicago. And he got one of the first ever EDD degrees from Indiana University, which he said he valued. He said, and by the way, I found both those dissertations, those written dissertations, in some things I got when he passed and my grandmother passed, and I donated them to the Camden Carroll Library, so they're in the library. But he said there wasn't much scholarship in his doctorate. But you have to understand, and I want to state this and it's really strange to read it nowadays, because his master's thesis was on the training of white teachers in Kentucky, because at that time there was great separation. But again, going back to what he was an enigma because I saw him. He was a guy that when I wanted to throw a baseball, and he and my dad, we threw baseballs. He took me to the golf course. He was an athlete, loved to play. But people viewed him as the great stone face. He had a very dry sense of humor in public. He appreciated a good joke, but he wouldn't laugh a lot. And everybody was scared of him. I mean, because when you recall in his presence, there was never a smile. It's just, the great stone face. But, I didn't see things that way as a little boy growing up, because starting in the 50s, when I was old enough to remember anything, that wasn't what I got from either he or Dr. Dorn. Of course, as a little child, they treat you a little differently than they would somebody who works for them. So, but that's what I remember from Dr. Lappin.
Dr. Grody said he was the most professional man he ever knew, and he learned professionalism and how to be professional with faculty and staff from Dr. Lappin.
Well, I'd say a lot of that came from his upbringing from his father in the church, and W.O. Lappin. He told a few. I actually was, as a small child, met W.O. Lappin before he passed away. I was fortunate enough to meet my great-grandfather. And it was really amazing. He was a very professional person because he didn't get off center. If there was something he needed to deal with, he dealt with it. He dealt with it as unemotionally as possible. And if you think about a lot of the problems you have with relationships and employment, emotion gets involved. And he just wasn't going to get emotional. It was, this is what we're going to do. Here's the regulation. Here's the rule. Here's what we're going to do to deal with it. And he tried, here's an example. And you think, well, he was an academician and he wouldn't do anything for other organizations. A story he told once was about Bobby Laughlin. Coach Laughlin was the athletic director and basketball coach, but the baseball, baseball was my granddad's love. I mean, he really loved the game. And they were not going to let the baseball players out an hour early for batting practice. And he had to go to Coach Laughlin and explain. He said, Coach, he said, batting practice to baseball is like your pregame warm-up line in basketball. You've got to do it. You've got to let them out. And this is a guy who's letting athletes out of class rather than make them stay in. So it's just, he did things that he thought was right, he thought were right, but it was very low-key, very quiet, he turned it, what he told me once, and I've got this from other people, he turned this presidency job down twice. And I guess my two brothers are to blame because he wanted to take time to watch his grandchildren grow up. Because the presidency does take so much time.
Well, Dr. Ellis told us that if it wasn't for Dr. Lappin, this university might have folded during World War II.
Well, I don't know about that. World War II was let me tell you about my experiences, and I'm going to tell you about an experience I had, not in World War II because obviously I wasn't alive, but after. This is, World War II, all the students, all the male students were in the military. There wasn't anybody to come to class. And he and another gentleman here at the university, and I can't call his name, I don't know it, worked very hard with the vice president and people to make Moorhead State a naval base, a naval training station for a school of electricity. And they kept the doors open for 2 years, I think at least 2 years, and this was a naval base. And people don't realize that. They were staying in what was now Mays Hall, it was East Men's, it was Mays Hall. They marched to Lappin Hall for classes. They actually had a brig, a jail for their people, special jail, under the old Jane Stadium, which is now where the parking lot is for the Laughlin building. That's where it started. Laughlin building's where the old football stadium was. So he did a lot of things like that. And my experience with that was when I was working at the university, one summer day, it was kind of funny. I got a call from the science building and said, there's a guy down here who is a retired professor of physics at the University of Arkansas, Albert Solano. Dr. Solano had come here and he was one of the boys that was in that naval group. He was inspired to go to college after World War II by the things he saw in Lappin Hall. And he became so proficient and so good a student, he became a professor, a full professor of physics, and had several patents. He was a very wealthy man. I noticed the car he was driving, this was way back before anybody knew what a Range Rover was, and he was driving one, okay? So he was well off. He donated all his old scientific equipment to Lappin Hall. But in the process, he wanted to take a walking tour. So at that time, Mays Hall was under construction. Actually, it had been abandoned, and plans were to renovate it to what it is now. And I got a key from physical plant, and we went up there and looked around, and he got to one of the landings, and he said, this happened. I said, what happened, Dr. Solano? He said, my chief, there was a guy causing everybody a problem because he was big and tough, and I was a Golden Glove boxer, and the chief set up a fight, and I took him out. And the chief gave me any detail I wanted after that. But the time he was most emotional, and you've got to remember this about Moorhead, Kentucky back in the 40s and 30s, and maybe even early 50s. The time he got the most emotional was down at the train station, because he almost started crying. I actually did cry a little bit. He said, a lot of the boys who left here from school never came home. This is the last thing they remember about the United States. And that got to me, because at that time, that was the only way in and out of Moorhead, really efficiently, was the train. And he got emotional, but I had a really good day with Dr. Solano, and really, it was a very enjoyable day.
Do you remember what year Lappin Hall was dedicated?
I don't. I think it was about 57, 58, because the reason I know that, because I was really, really little, and my two brothers were, of course, they're younger brothers, and one of the things we had to do during the dedication was pull a string and uncover a portrait of him. So, and we got it done. We didn't mess up. We pulled the string. But I looked at that picture of that event, and we were very young. I'm thinking I was in the first or second grade, which would be 57, 58. But I'm just guessing.
When your grandfather was alive, was he aware of his legacy at the university?
I don't think he really worried about legacy. I don't think. I mean, he did what he did. He worked very hard. I think the beauty of his relationship with Dr. Dorn, and I've noticed this, I saw it, and he talked about it. And some people will disagree with this, and that's okay, but what I got from it was Dr. Dorn, when he came in, he was a Jedi master of working the political scene. He had been a Speaker of the House. He had, in Kentucky, he knew the politicians, he knew the system, he knew how to work it. Plus, at that time in the mid-50s was when the big burst of money from the federal government for education came in. Those two things. And I think what Dr. Dorn he was a brilliant man. Don't get me wrong, he was a very brilliant man. He decided, you know, if I leave the education to somebody who knows what they're doing, I can do what I want to do, and we can have a great relationship. And they did. For all the years my grandfather worked, he and Dr. Dorn, they worked together. Dr. Dorn did the fundraising, the PR, and was a master at it. And then my grandfather did the academics. And he was he used to do the class. It was so funny. I watched him when I was a little boy one day. He did the class schedule for the next semester by hand on a legal pad. And you know, you can imagine trying that now. Of course, it's expanded quite a bit. But he was able to keep that under control.
Yeah. A great transition here to Dr. Dorn. And I remember when we interviewed Wayne Martin, we asked him several questions about athletics and Dr. Dorn. We'll get to those in just a second. But did you know Dr. Dorn? And what was Dr. Dorn really like? Because
Dr. Dorn,
legendary figure.
Dr. Dorn was a truly great man that you had to know how to handle, how to deal with, because he was a preacher. He didn't, as they would say in the Deep South, he didn't cotton to anybody doing things that were not proper as far as what a normal, prudent person would do in situations. He didn't hold with alcohol. For example, here's an example. He did not believe in his teams playing on Sunday. If we had a baseball rain out, we had to get it in by Saturday because Sunday was not available to play ball on. That changed later on because the OVC changed. Our conference changed it. So, but he believed, and Dr. Dorn, I got along with him. Dr. Dorn was a friend. You have to understand, I was a little boy he watched grow up. I was there. My mother was assistant registrar. So I was at my mom's office, and it's right down the hall from Dr. Dorn, and I would see him and I'd say, "Hi, Dr. Dorn." And Mrs. Dorn, she knew me. My grandfather and grandmother were close friends to the Dorns. So I knew them, and it's so funny because my first job, I didn't have to apply for it. Didn't have to. Dr. Dorn knew I was graduating and actually for getting my master's. He says, "Jim," he said in his own way, "Jim," he said, "you need to come to my office Monday morning. We need to talk about your future." And I got my job that morning. He hired me, in an entry-level position, because he'd seen me grow up. I'd worked with Keith Capus. I'd worked with people in that area, and he basically said, "You need to stay here at the university." You know, between my mother and my grandfather was 50 years, my mother 26, so that's 76. And if you take my 23, that's close to 100 years total in the family. So, but Dr. Dorn, I considered him a friend. I mean, he was one person. Let me tell you another thing. It's still, at this date, I'm 63 years old, and I'm retired, and have been retired for 8 years. But if I had a meeting to go see Dr. Andrews right now in the president's office, you don't go not wearing a tie. You just don't do it. That's the upbringing I got with Dr. Dorn. You went looking like you knew what you were doing. And that's the way it was expected, and that's just old training, I guess. It's ingrained in me.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Dr. Dorn and Marshall Banks. Dr. Dorn was very progressive with desegregation on this campus, and of course, Marshall Banks, Dr. Banks, was brought in as the first black athlete in the state of Kentucky.
Yes, he was.
Talk a little bit about that, what you think Dr. Dorn's thought was, and sort of the struggles that Banks might have had.
Well, not only Dr. Banks, but there were others after Dr. Banks. But we'll talk about Dr. Banks because Dr. Marshall Banks was a class, and he's got his doctor's degree, so he's a very intelligent man. And he was actually brought in, I think, to play basketball. And the time wasn't quite right for that to happen because the places we had to play in the Ohio Valley Conference were all in Tennessee and in Western Kentucky and other places where it was just difficult to do. And Dr. Banks ended up running track, which at that time, if you think about it, track had been an area, and I'm not going to say this is right or wrong, where African Americans had been allowed to achieve. But Jesse Owens in the Berlin Olympics was the star, and track athletes. Jackie Robinson had been a track star at UCLA. So, but Dr. Banks was a star athlete. There was another athlete after that named Howard Murphy. I think Howard was the first football player to play in. He actually played in the OVC. He was our star running back. He's from Ohio. And Dr. Dorn was very progressive, and I think a lot of that had to do with his being a preacher. You know, his beliefs were that all God's children should be treated equally. And he tried to make it a part of the way Morehead State was, and he was progressive. We were the first school in Kentucky, in the OVC, to have black athletes, to break the color line. And you got to remember, we're in Kentucky now. People don't realize this, and I'm going to deviate from what you want to go with, but think about this. Jackie Robinson was the first black baseball player, right? Everybody gives Branch Rickey the credit. Who was a commissioner of baseball? Happy Chandler, a good friend of Dr. Dorn. Sorry. Hadn't been for Happy Chandler, I know that might have happened, because my understanding was the Philadelphia Phillies weren't going to play, and he called them and said, hey, if you don't play, you're out of baseball. So maybe Kentucky deserves, maybe the state of Kentucky and some of the people in Kentucky deserve a lot more credit than what they get.
You know, I've read stories that Dorn had said to some of the black athletes, if they don't let you in hotels or restaurants, I'm going to go with you and make sure they will.
I never heard that story. It may have been true, and I don't doubt it. Dr. Dorn is not one. Dr. Dorn was not one to stand in the shadows. He would be there, and the thing is, and I don't mean this as a negative, he might have been there with a photographer. He's going to document it well for everybody in the world to see how our people are treated. So he would have used it as an attack point. But Dr. Dorn might have said that. There was always a way to work it out. For the basketball players, the football player like Marshall Banks, and the track guy like Marshall Banks, football like Howard Murphy. Later on, the basketball and football train we had to Birmingham, Alabama. That was the amazing thing. All those guys would have been stars at Auburn or University of Alabama, and we got them because they couldn't go there.
Jim, in all your years working with athletics and being around campus, what are some of the great memories of sports teams that you have?
Oh, sports teams. I think watching as a little boy, the first one was watching the Granville Williams team that won the OVC tournament, beat Eastern and Western, beat Xavier, lost to UK in the NCAA, and had a great team. Watching them play as a little boy was kind of fun. Watching the Lamar Green Hobo Jackson team later on under Coach Bob Wright. They won. They were co-champions, but lost to Murray State in the playoffs. The Bill Harrell teams were all fun. The baseball teams I was involved with sports. I was the baseball manager. They won the championship in '73 and '77. My younger brother played on the '77 team, and they got to go to Mark Light Field in Miami and play in the NCAA. So those are great memories. Personally, a personal memory was a day in April back in about '77 or '78, '77 I guess. I'm sitting in my office as sports information director, and the phone rings, and out of breath New Yorker. It means he's out of breath. He says he'd been running to get to a phone. He said, "Phil Simms just drafted #1. What can you tell me about him?" Which started a litany of calls. But as a journalist, you can think about this. My 15 minutes of fame got messed up because I was quoted in the New York Times and they got my name wrong. The New York Times now, accuracy, got my name wrong. But I can live with that. I said my 15 minutes of fame was under somebody else's.
Well, Jim, kind of pulling it all back here to the grand specter of this institution and all of its history, what has Morehead State University meant to our region?
I think all you have to do is see one thing. One thing, go to graduation. When I graduated in '73, the first time, second time '75, my master's, and then do it in '15. And the president will ask in every graduation, how many of you are the first person in your family to graduate? The show of hands is immense. It's amazing at this day and age. Back in '73, you understand it. In 2015, wow. That's what it means. It means we're educating the people of our area. The people, you know, it's been a much maligned area. I'm from my family, my dad, my mom. I was born in actually Lexington, but my first place to live was in Prestonsburg for a year. Had family in Floyd County, and it's much maligned. But it's maligned for a reason, because a lot of people didn't do anything. My dad used to laugh and tell stories because the first three words the little children are taught in Floyd County are Dayton, Detroit, and Middletown. That's where they go for jobs. And but Moorhead is letting them Moorhead State got them an education and got them an opportunity to stay and work in their area and make a difference. They can make a difference now. You know, if those hands stop going, it's like they stop going up, then we've achieved our goal. But it seems like our goal is a never-ending battle, like Superman, a never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way, right?
If the school was never here in Moorhead, what would this town be?
Oh my goodness. Well, you've got to remember, Moorhead at one time had a reputation of being the dirtiest, roughest town on the planet. My granddad used to tell me there was a shooting every Saturday night down on Railroad Street. I'll tell you this story about my granddad was also, Dr. Lappin was also a mayor of Moorhead several times. And one time in the late 30s, this is the late 30s now, he got a telegraph, on a CNO telegraph, that there was an escaped prisoner from Lexington on the train, and they need to help getting him off and getting him back down there. So there was about 10 guys around the telegraph office that knew that, and my granddad knew them all. He said, guys, go home and get your guns, and we'll get this guy off the train. Nobody had to go home. They were all packing heat. That tells you what kind of land. That's just like, now they talk about inner cities now where all the young kids pack heat. Back then in the 30s they packed heat. It was a rough town. I think education and the university has helped change a lot of that. Of course, a lot of things the people did themselves. For 40 years, 50, I don't know how many years, Moorhead was a dry county. They saw what alcohol was doing to people. And Dr. Dorn, when he got here, made sure it stayed that way as much as he could. But things did change, and it hasn't been, society has changed. But Moorhead changed a lot because it needed to change. Again, that was before I was born, but I just heard stories. And my granddad, you know, he just told me, he said there was people, one of the town sheriffs, there was a guy who committed murder, and they knew where he was, and they went to arrest him. The guy came out on the front porch with a rifle and raised it quickly, and the sheriff had drawn and shot him before my granddad saw his hand move. He said, you can see all these fast draws on television. Sorry, it wasn't even close. This guy was, and this is just an old country town sheriff, but he could sure draw a 6-gun.
Just what's something you can say about the history of our university and what you hope the future of this institution will be?
Well, I hope we're in a situation, again, with the money, you know, money goes up and down. As the economy goes up and down, so does money, and that's the key to keeping good teachers and getting students to come here. I think we're moving along, we're trying to modernize, which is very important. My dream for Moorhead State University is if in 15 to 20 years, of course I'll probably be gone then, but to have the same effect at graduation. To say, have the president, whoever it may be, say, how many of you all are the first ones to graduate in your family, to have all those hands still go up? Because that lets everybody know we're doing our job. When those hands, you know, and that gets people going, gets people into education. Now, obviously, the more we do our job, the less people will be the first ones. But still, I mean, and maybe in 50 years, no hands go up. They've all had people come through Moorhead State University. They're all legacies. They're all, and that would be wonderful. You know, I mean, but it just takes time. It takes time and people going out and seeing the value of education where they can get a better job. That's the name of the game.
You think your grandfather would be proud of the institution?
I think he would. I think he'd be very proud of athletics. He'd be proud of the academic side. I think the sheer size of it would make him shake his head because he's not used to seeing the number of people, a number of, you know, everything. I think he'd be very proud because his idea was to teach people, and you know, he was the principal of this Breckenridge. He was the first principal of Breckenridge training, and it was so funny because he brought him as baseball coach. He became principal here, but it was just one of those things. I know he'd be proud, because to see Morehead State University at almost, 9,000 students, and have a beautiful campus, have the space science, be graduating into the 21st century as we need to do, I think he'd be very proud.
All right, well, Jim, I think that's all we got. You're
That
a great
it?
interview.
I try to be,
You
brother.
have to pull teeth to get
No, I talk too much. I talk too much. I'm not a bit afraid about talking, and lots of things. Like I said, if I offended anybody with what I said, I'm sorry, but I believe everything I told you.
you did
And people don't. And the thing is, people aren't doing enough. People don't do enough on the state level to give Happy Chandler, because you remember when he got really old, he made a statement that was a racist, quote, racist statement. It was a statement you'd make in 1950, which it wasn't racist then. He was 91 and semi-senile.
Right.
And the guy, if it hadn't been for him, Jackie Robinson might not have been the first player, at least not that year.
Yeah.
He set that up. He forced it.
I like his campaign when he ran for re-election as Kentucky governor. Be like you're happy and vote for happy.
Yeah. Well, he was a well, it's kind of funny because I didn't know I didn't recognize him as an old man, but when my father was active in politics and in the Democratic Party, and when he had his funeral, an old man came by and shook my hand, my brother's hand, my mother's hand. I said, "Mom, who was that?" He says, "Happy Chandler." He came from Woodford County to my dad's funeral, so that was pretty impressive. So I've been a fan of the Chandler family ever since. But after reading the stuff about Jackie Robinson and Branch Rickey, and not hearing the same about Happy Chandler, who from afar, from the office in New York, set it up, and basically of course he couldn't control the people and the fans throwing things at Mr. Robinson, but he told the players, if you don't play against him, you're done. You're done.
All right.
Guys, I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim.